physics. And this is a very important topic, primarily because of the fact that science and this subject called metaphysics are two things that definitely impact on our lives. It's interesting to note how many of us are affected by scientific discoveries that have been made that have the ability to improve the quality of our lives. But at the same time, many of the scientists who spend a great deal of their lives doing research and developing theories and products are of the notion that science is the highest form of existence, that the people who are able to create these devices, the televisions and the VCRs and the space shuttles, are the most brilliant individuals that have ever existed on this planet. That the science and technology that exists today has taken us to the highest plateau that man has ever existed on this planet. And that's not true. It's not true at all, particularly when you're able to study the history of mankind, particularly from an Afrocentric perspective. And when you do that, you find that in many ways we are very primitive compared to some of the ways of the ancients. We have to begin to understand what the differences are. We have to also begin to understand what are those aspects that we can begin to incorporate in our lives, which will allow us to become the best people possible. Last year, Newsweek magazine had on its cover this particular story, The Search for Adam and Eve. It's in the November 11th issue of Newsweek magazine. And this story is important because it dealt with a very controversial theory, as they describe here in the cover of this magazine. It's also important too because the story originally came out in January of 1987. But it didn't make the cover of Newsweek until January of 1988. And just recently, in October of 1989, it also was presented again in USA Today. So this story keeps coming out, and what's so interesting is the results of a finding of scientists, biologists at the University of California at Berkeley, and also biologists at London University, who did a study of a cross-section of people, studied the mitochondrial DNA of a cross-section of people from all over this planet, and they came to one conclusion, and that is that every man, woman, and child on this planet has one common denominator. That is the mitochondrial DNA that links them to an African woman. In other words, every person on this planet is of African descent, genetically. Like, that has biologically been proven. So that's one good thing about science that we can applaud right now. That is that they finally came to a conclusion that African people stated hundreds, if not thousands of years ago, that African people were the first people on the planet. So then, as science begins to unlock some doors for us, it allows us the opportunity to look back at statements and discoveries that were made by our ancestors and to see the validity of those statements. One of the most profound things that our ancestors studied and understood was that man was a model of the universe. The old adage, as above, so below, those things that exist outside of this planet also exist on this planet and within man. Man is a reflection of the universe. And to the degree that a person is able to understand himself or herself is the same degree that that person will be able to understand the workings of the universe. They are directly connected. They are not separated or isolated. If man understands this knowledge of himself, the knowledge of the universe, then they find that he will also begin to understand other aspects of knowledge and information that will help to expand your level of awareness. Much of this information can be found in the study of astronomy, astrology, mathematics, medicine, symbolism, spirituality, and religion, as well as architecture. And when you study the development of man in ancient Kemet, you find that all of these aspects were incorporated in the ancient Nile Valley civilizations. If we look at the development of man, scientists said that mankind and civilization began in Africa. So if we look at that, if we accept that reality and look at the literature, we'll find that the ancient Kemetians had a word, Africa, which meant the birthplace, which literally meant the birthplace of mankind, the birthplace of culture and civilization. And those of you who have had an opportunity to read some of the works of Diop, who talks about the two cradle theory of man, or have had an opportunity to hear Dr. Edwin Nichols talk about the axiological references between the different types of people that inhabit this planet, you can begin to understand how the various races came about. How if mankind began in Africa, and as these African people began to migrate to different parts of the planet, they began to adapt to changes in the environment. Moving into a colder environment, they began to wear more clothing, more animal skins, which insulated their skin from the sunlight. They began to get gradually lighter and lighter. In a colder environment, their facial features would constrict. The noses would become smaller, the lips would become thinner, their hair would become lighter and straighter to insulate the body, and eventually, over a period of years, a new race of people evolved. This has also been scientifically proven to be a fact. This is how the various races of people on this planet speciated or evolved because of a means of adapting to climatic conditions. So, if we understand that, and more specifically, if we understand what Dr. Nichols talks about in dealing with the axiological references between the European and the African, when the African was living in this tropical environment on the continent of Africa, most of his basic needs were taken care of. Food was easily accessible. Clothing was not a big concern. Shelter was easily made, so that with having the bare necessities of life already met, they can begin to focus their attention on the development of their mind, the development of their intellect. They can begin to study their surroundings and benefit from accumulating this knowledge. One of the things that they saw is that they saw a direct connection, a direct correlation between the sources of creation and them being able to benefit from that. In other words, the creator, or whatever these forces of creation were, seemed to have blessed these people by giving them an abundance of food, clothing, and shelter. But those Africans who migrated to the north, who settled in Europe, in a harsh or cold environment, found that they had to struggle for their existence. Found that food was not as plentiful. They had to learn how to grow the food. They found that there were only basically 3 months out of the year in which to plant the food. After the food was planted, they had to be able to harvest the food. After the food was harvested, they had to be able to store the food and to protect the food from other people who didn't have it. They had to also defend themselves from the elements, from the cold, defend themselves from other people who didn't have what they had. So that began to develop a more aggressive mindset within these people. These people also saw nature as something that they had to do battle with on a continual basis. They saw nature as something that they had to conquer. So this idea of them surviving because they were forced to do battle against the elements, and only, as they said, only the strong survived. Only those who had the strength or the wits were able to survive and make it from one year to the next. And these people eventually became the more powerful people because they evolved to become more aggressive. So you have two basic mindsets. Diop talks about this two cradle theory, this two cradle concept, and how you have one people in the South who have a more genteel mindset, who live in harmony with nature. You have another group of people in the North who are more aggressive and are forced by their environment to see nature as an enemy and something that has to be conquered. So then, as these two groups of people began to develop their various cultures and civilizations, they saw nature from two different perspectives. They developed two different types of sciences, and that's what we're going to be focusing on. The definition of science is that science comes from the word sere, which means to know. So when we talk about the development of science, the very beginning of development of science, we're talking about people who began to gather knowledge just from observing those things that went on around them. And they began to record that information, they documented that information, and then they passed it on from one generation to the next. In ancient Kemet, we find the earliest examples of the development of sciences, and that one of the first sciences to develop was the science of astronomy. And that is, when people have their basic requirements of life met, they'll often sit down and watch the movement of the sun. They watch the movement of the stars across the sky at night. They'll watch the moon go through its metamorphosis. You know, those of you who came here this evening, if you noticed the moon, you saw a new crescent moon, and right next to that moon was a star, was Venus, actually, a planet, Venus. And if you observe that moon every night, you're going to see the moon begin to get bigger and bigger. And then you're going to see the moon reach a point where it's going to start to get smaller and smaller. And then the cycle will begin all over again. So to the people who were seeing this for the first time, this truly amazed them. And as you watch this, you can see a pattern unfolding before your very eyes. And that planet Venus, which is in close proximity to the new moon, is going to change its position every day. So they can see everything around them is moving. The sun moves in the sky. Everything around them is in motion. So that automatically begins to capture your interest. And by observing these changes, they began to learn some very phenomenal things. The ancient Egyptians knew of the movement of the moon. They knew of the phases of the moon. They knew of at least 5 planets. And the word planet comes from a Latin word which means wanderer. So the planets were those stars that appeared to wander across the heavens, didn't seem to maintain a fixed position in the sky. They wandered from one point to the next. And they saw this difference. There was a discernible difference between these balls of light that stayed in the same configuration like some of the constellations that we see, and then other balls of light that appeared to wander across the sky. So by observing this phenomenon, and then by recording this phenomenon, they began to see a cause and effect relationship between the position of certain stars or planets in the sky and something that occurred on the planet below. It was through understanding and cataloging these events that the science of astrology evolved. And those of you who have read John Jackson's Introduction to African Civilization will see in that book, he describes how the various stellar configurations were given their symbolic associations with animals, because the position of those stars in the sky reflected certain activities that took place on the earth associated with agriculture. So if we look at the beginning or the development of agriculture, you see that it's directly related to the understanding of man to the movement of stars in the sky. They would learn that there were certain times when you could plant your seeds based on the position of the moon or the phase of the moon and the position of certain stars in the sky. And it's been said in a number of historical books that the first farmers, the first people to develop the science of agriculture were the women. And that it was the women who oftentimes were in the home, who were tending the children while the men may have been out hunting or doing some other things. It was the women who really had the time to observe the movements of the sun and the stars. It was also women who saw a profound relationship between one of the most important bodies in the sky and themselves, that is the moon. The women saw that the moon would undergo a metamorphosis, a phase, just as they would undergo a metamorphosis, a phase, a 28-day cycle. And that cycle was the same as the cycle of the moon. So that when they began to catalog this information, they began to catalog this information in association with the stellar systems that they saw. They began to develop lunar calendars that were based on 13th month, which is associated to the various phases of the moon. There was a solar calendar of 365 and a quarter days. There also were stellar calendars that were based on the position of certain stars or certain constellations in the heavens. So they had three distinct ways of plotting and clocking the movements of events in the heavens and activities that also took place on the planet Earth. One very good example of this process as it relates to agriculture is the significance of the star Sirius. Sirius was referred to as the dog star. The star Sirius would rise, this is around January, excuse me, not January, but June 21st. Around June 21st, the star Sirius would rise just before sunrise, and this would signal the annual flooding of the Nile. It was the annual flooding of the Nile that made possible life in Kemet, because it was the annual flooding of the Nile which brought a new layer of silt, a new deposits of soil to the east and the west bank of the Nile. And they saw this phenomena occur on an annual basis. When you would have the heliacal rising of this star Sirius, or when this star Sirius rose just before the sun did, and it only occurred during one time of the year, the flooding of the Nile always came after it. So Sirius on one hand was referred to as the dog star, and that symbolically one of the things that a dog does or a watchdog does is to warn you when somebody or something is coming. So these symbols, the association of symbols with these stars was very important, was very significant. And one of the other things that the ancestors did when they began to plot the movement of these stars and star systems was to develop a calendar. And this calendar of 365 and a quarter days was associated with symbols which they call netters. And the netters represented principles or concepts of the various sources of creation. There were 36 netters in total, 18 male and 18 female. And each of these netters were associated with certain star systems or constellations in the heaven. And each of these netters were given dominion or rule over a 10% portion of the sky. In other words, one of the things that our ancestors did was to divide the sky into a circle which had a circumference of 360 degrees. And 10 degrees was given to each of the 36 decans, or 36 netters. 36 netters having 10 degrees each within this circle, 360 degrees, would give you 360 days. And 5 additional days were associated to the netters who were responsible for giving birth to these other 36 netters. So that each day was associated with a principle which reflected an aspect of the Creator. They were able to not only divide the year up into segments, but they also divided the day up into segments. The day was associated with several of the sun deities, Horus being one, Ra or Re being the other. Re was one of the terms for one of the more popular deities or gods in Kemet. And it's from the word Re that we've gotten the term a ray of light. It refers to this ancient African concept of the deity symbolized by the sun. And then you have another manifestation of the sun when it was in another position in the sky, in which it was associated with the deity Set. Set represents the forces of darkness, symbolically the forces of darkness, which is where we have derived the word sunset, where the sun goes when it disappears from the horizon. These are symbolic terms that express the relationship of the sun relative to the earth. And Clyde, if you can you bring me a copy of my book back here for a second? I wanted to make a couple of references. Also, what's important too is understanding how the ancients, in plotting the movements of the sun, the stars, and the moon, were able to develop not only the first calendar, thank you, not only the first calendar, but also the first clock, the first timekeeping mechanism. They devised the second, the minute, and the hour as a means of keeping track of this movement. And as I stated on several occasions, the word hour is derived from the word Horus. Let me just read you a couple of things from my book in the chapter Paying Homage to the Sun about the significance of the sun. The sun is 93 million miles away, yet it exerts the most powerful force on the planet. It is the radiant day star which gazes down upon us from the heavens and is the giver of all life. It has been the oldest and most common object of worship in the history of mankind. It is the sun. All living things hunger for the light and the warmth of the sun that falls on us like a blanket of love. The first day of the week was named in honor of it. The second day of the week, Monday, means the day of the moon, which is illuminated by the sun. The lengthening of the days and nights during the course of the year are the hallmarks of our four seasons. The spring and fall equinox signal a time of equal day and equal night on the planet. The summer and winter solstices represent the longest and shortest days of the year, respectively. For over 5,000 years, people have acknowledged the sun as a symbol of goodness, strength, and spiritual rebirth. The sun is the power behind the process of photosynthesis, the means by which plants grow, animals feed on the energy-enriched plants, and man uses both plants and animals for food, shelter, and clothing. The sun evaporates water from rivers, lakes, oceans, which form clouds, and water falls from these clouds as rain or snow. Clouds are visible bodies of fine droplets of water or particles of ice dispersed in the atmosphere, which change the temperature and air pressure, thus influencing the weather on the earth below. After each rainstorm or snowstorm, the sun shines brightly to repeat the cycle and draw the water back up into the clouds. If the sun stopped shining, all life on the planet would cease as we know it. The air would freeze and the earth would become nothing more than an empty waste ball of rock drifting endlessly through space. The relationship that exists between the earth and the sun is such a fine and delicate relationship that if the sun was any closer or any further away than it is, then all life would perish. So this relationship was something that our ancestors saw, understood, and later associated with this system that was called religion. So that one very important reality that we have to understand as the first forms of science evolved was that the science of time, understanding what time it was, understanding the various phases of the sun, the moon, knowing when certain ceremonies were to begin is very important. Everything that we do is a result of this important relationship that revolves around time. So a point that I've made over and over again is that time is something that we cannot take for granted. Many of us tease and make fun of black folk and the particular time reference that black folks have. We call it CP time. Colored people are always late, don't do things on time. And when you deal with the universe, you have to be on time. If the sun didn't rise when it was supposed to rise, it would throw everything off. If Sirius didn't rise when it was supposed to rise, it would throw everything off. If the moon didn't go through its phases when it was supposed to, it would throw everything off. Everything operates on a precise time frame. And that time frame is something that is very important for us as African people if we are to begin to understand where we are and truly understand where it is that we're supposed to go. There's also a radio station right here in the Washington area, in Alexandria, I believe, a radio station called WCPT, W Colored People's Time, that plays nothing but oldies. You know, so we have a habit of making fun of something that is very serious, but it's also something that we need to be very cognizant of. I want to talk about symbols and symbolic thought and the importance of them. Symbols are carefully chosen from the natural world, or the netters. And each symbol chosen is that which best expresses or represents a function or a principle. All of the symbols that were chosen were symbols that were associated, in many instances, to animals, were symbols that were associated to qualities or aspects of animals that were significant. I cited the Sirius symbolism as one. So a symbol therefore represents a specific principle or function on all levels simultaneously, from the simple, most obvious manifestation to the most abstract metaphysical form. Horus as a symbol that is associated with the sun is important because one of the symbols for Horus was the falcon. The eye of Horus is a symbol that represented the sun. The eye of Horus is a symbol that is also a symbol that is associated with God, the primary deity, in that God, like the sun, stands over the planet and is able to see and influence everything on the planet below. Anubis was a symbol that, Anubis was the jackal in ancient Kemetic symbolism, a symbol that was associated with the scene of judgment. Anubis was the animal or the jackal who represents the qualities of fine judgment, because of qualities that are inherent to the characteristics of a jackal. The serpent is a very important symbol that we see repeated over and over again in ancient Kemet. The serpent is an animal or creature that has a forked tongue. The serpent also has a forked penis. The serpent also has this process of shedding his skin, so that aspects of the serpent came to represent this quality called duality. The ability to exist on two levels, the ability to discriminate, and it was symbolic. The serpent was symbolic of a higher and a lower intellect, the duality between the two aspects of the intellect. So it's interesting to see how the serpent has been represented in recent times, in modern times. The serpent is a symbol associated with something that is evil, as opposed to something that represents the duality of the human intellect. The vulture is a symbol that was associated with the assimilation or the passing over to the afterworld. And if you've noticed on the symbol of the crown of the pharaoh, you see the pharaoh when he was alive would wear a crown that had the serpent on it. That serpent would reflect this intellect, or the dual aspects of the intellect. And after that pharaoh died, on all representations of that pharaoh, they would show the crown, the pharaoh wearing the crown, the serpent on it, and also the vulture. The vulture was symbolic of assimilation. Those two symbols were only shown together after the pharaoh had died. And once again, it's interesting to see how contemporary individuals misunderstand these symbols. Those of you who have ever seen the movie The Ten Commandments will notice in the movie, Yul Brynner, who supposedly represents the pharaoh Ramesses, wears throughout the entire movie the pharaonic crown that has the cobra and the vulture on it, a symbol that is associated with death. And that was primarily because they were taking the symbolism directly from the crown of King Tut, and they didn't understand what the symbols on that crown meant. So to have symbols and to not understand the essence behind the symbols means that the symbols don't have the power, they don't have the significance that they were supposed to have. But one of the very important things that we see that came out of the study of the heavens, the movement of the stars, the learning of time, was a science called mathematics. And it's through mathematics that they began to be able to further plot other relationships. Most of what is known about Egyptian mathematics comes from a papyrus that was made in the Middle Kingdom called the Rhind Papyrus. It was a papyrus that was a scroll that had mathematical problems and solutions on it that were made primarily for children. And on the basis of the study of this document, mathematicians and other theoreticians have come to the conclusions that the ancient Egyptians had a high understanding of mathematics through a study of some of their architectural structures. It's also obvious that they had a high understanding of calculus and geometry, things that we do not normally associate with African people. In dealing with the higher forms of math, we find that numbers were sometimes called the language of the absolute, in that everything that is a part of life can be expressed in some numerical form. Everything that is a part of life can be reduced to principles or frequencies of numbers. So therefore, numbers play very important roles. Even in computers, the computer systems that we have today are based on a binary system, and that is dealing with two very simple numbers, 0 and 1, which are symbolic of something being turned on and something being turned off. By dealing with these two very elementary numbers, you can develop some very complicated systems. Another important aspect of numbers can be associated with words. Words in ancient Kemet were seen as things that evoked power. If you look in the Bible, Genesis begins with the statement that in the beginning was the Word. And it talks about how God brought the world into existence via the spoken word. Let there be light, and there was light. Let there be earth, and there was earth. And then the animals came into existence via the spoken word. In ancient Egyptian documents, Ra also brings the world into existence via the same process. So this idea of the word and the power of the word is something that is very significant, in that when we look at ancient Kemetian writing, or their use of words, the medu-neter, as opposed to the hieroglyphs. The word hieroglyphs is a Greek word which means sacred carvings. The medu-neter is the writing or the words of the gods. Okay? And that in looking at the medu-neter, whenever they wrote this language, they would always write the consonants and never the vowels. Okay? Always write the consonants. Those who were part of the priesthood in dealing with this language for specific purposes never wrote the vowels. And as the scientists began to study the science of words, or the science of languages, what they found is that consonants vibrate at a rate that is different from vowels. Vowels vibrate at a rate which is 500 times faster than consonants. And if you think about the consonants A, E, I, O, U, when you say them, when you say these letters A, E, I, O, U, a different effect is produced. Because when you use the consonants, your tongue blocks the flow of energy, or the flow of the breath through your mouth, except when you say the vowels A, E, I, O, U. So that symbolically, when they were writing the medu-neters, or the language of the gods, the writing of the gods, it was in essence as though the consonants were symbolic of bricks that were used to create certain symbolic structures, and the vowels were the mortar which held these bricks together. In other words, you can build things, you can create things through using the physical substance of the consonants, but the power of the vowels are what brings them into manifestation. It's what supports them and gives them structure. And if you notice, there are no words in the English language that I know of. There are no words that don't contain vowels. So this symbolic essence is still there in the language today. If we look at medicine, the science of medicine, in Kemet, the neter, and the word neter is a word that we can use to describe God, if we will. The word neter clearly identifies this whole process of the deity, and that it represents the principle of the manifestation of the primary deity. And in Kemet, the neter associated with writing or speaking was the neter called Jehudi. Jehudi was representative of the spoken word, He was the nectar associated with divine articulation of speech. He was the nectar associated with writing, with science, and with medicine. Jehudi is known to us today by the names Thoth, by the names Hermes, and the name Mercury. Imhotep is regarded as the father of medicine, and by studying ancient Kemetic history, we find that Imhotep incorporated a strong astrological belief in the practice of medicine, and that specific medicines were given at specific times to patients. I had an opportunity to really understand what this all meant a couple of years ago in 1985 when I went to Ethiopia and met an Ethiopian herbologist at the university in Addis. And this man was in the process of writing a book on herbs. And in this book, he showed us the treatment for various illnesses that he had treated with for some of the patients in Egypt. He had a number of photographs of people that had various forms of cancer, cancer of the throat, cancer on the legs and the arms. And these photographs were amazing. One particular photograph I remember, he showed a woman that had a cancerous growth on her neck, and her neck was the size of a grapefruit. In another photograph he showed us, the lump on the woman's neck was reduced to about the size of a marble. And in another photograph, you couldn't even tell that the woman had any cancer on the neck. So the before and after photographs were remarkable. When we asked him, well, how long did it take this process, this healing process to occur? A year, 2 years, 3 years? He said, oh, about 3 months. And the only thing he treated many of his patients with were herbs. And he began to talk about how he had learned the science of herbology from his father, and his father had learned it from his father before him. And that if we had had enough time, he would have taken us out with him to show us how he plants the herb, how he gathers the herbs. But he was just telling us how, and you don't just go out and pick a particular plant that supposedly has certain qualities. You have to be able to know the qualities associated with the different plants. And he put out this list, this chart of at least 75 different plants. And he showed the properties of these different plants and the different ailments that it would cure. He then went on to say that a plant that would heal a particular ailment at one time of the year may cause a particular problem at another time of the year. So you had to know exactly when to pick these plants, because the energy of the life-giving properties of the plant will be at one level in the spring and will be at another level in the fall. He also mentioned that the soil that the plants grew in was important as well, because the plants would take in certain nutrients and certain minerals that are in the soil. So therefore, you would want to pick certain plants that grew at a certain level of a mountain. Certain plants you want to, certain herbs or certain plants you want to pick at the bottom of the mountain. Certain other herbs you would want to pick midway of the mountain. And other herbs you want to pick at the very top of the mountain. So as he began to explain what I thought was a very simple process, I began to see how very complicated, how deeply involved this process was. And he had showed us how this knowledge and information had been passed on from generation to generation. One of the important things that he mentioned specifically about the herbs is their ability to work on one specific part of the body, and that part of the body alone. He said the problem with traditional medicine is that you can take medication for your eyes and it might cause a problem with your liver. And so then you take another pill to deal with your liver, and that causes a problem with your stomach. So then you take another medication to counteract the negative effects of that medication. Most of the medications that we have today are chemically created, are man-made medicines as opposed to natural medicines. And this whole idea of things being natural, of things being related to nature goes all the way back to this concept of the netters. And the netters, again, represents the principles or the manifestations of the Creator. So that if man is, in essence, a reflection of the universe, then the things that can heal us are already a part of the universe. They do not have to be man-made. The only time we find that they are man-made is when they're made to fatten the purses of pharmaceutical companies. Okay? So these are some very important realities that we have to look at. But there was a book that was written a couple of years ago, and a movie that was made about 2 years ago entitled "The Serpent and the Rainbow." And I don't know how many of you had an opportunity to see the movie or to read the book, but it was interesting in that the movie focused on Haiti and so-called voodoo in Haiti. And the movie documented that voodoo was something that was very significant, in that what it involved was these priests who would give this herbal solution to this victim that would cause them to become comatose. It would cause their heart rate to slow down, it would cause their respiration to slow down, and it would appear that this person is dead. So that the person would be buried, and then this herb or this solution would wear off, and these priests would come back and then dig up this body and then give this person another drug which would keep them in a zombie-like state. They would be conscious of what was going on around them, but they were not able to control their actions. And these people were used by other folks. And supposedly this is a true story. The person that went to Haiti and did the research documented what this particular compound was, and it was supposedly is being developed by a pharmaceutical company for use in the medical field. But many of the things, it's very interesting, many of the things that supposedly backwards or primitive people have associated as a part of their superstitious lore are founded in certain physical beliefs or certain medicinal beliefs. One thing that's very interesting too with the deterioration of the rainforest in Brazil is that there are literally hundreds, if not thousands, of plants that have never been cataloged. Hundreds, if not thousands, of plants that have various medicinal properties. That could be the cure for cancer, that could be the cure for multiple sclerosis, that mankind, unfortunately, may never have an opportunity to benefit from because they are all being destroyed. When you look at medicine in ancient Kemet, it's interesting to find that many scientists now are beginning to really appreciate what had been developed thousands of years ago in ancient Kemet. They found that contraceptives were made by the ancient Kemetians by grounding up spikes from the acacia tree and mixing it with honey and dates. And when scientists began to study this recorded phenomena, what they found is that the acacia, the spikes from the acacia tree, contain lactic acid. And lactic acid is one of the primary ingredients in contraceptives. They also found that the ancient Egyptians had developed a pregnancy test many thousands of years ago. A pregnancy test where they would take the urine of a woman who thought she was pregnant and pour it in a container, and then they would place a container or a bag of barley, and the other was barley and wheat. And they would put these two bags in this container of urine, and if the wheat began to sprout, then it meant that the woman was pregnant and that she was going to have a boy. And if the barley began to sprout, it means that she was pregnant, but she was going to have a girl. Now, this urine pregnancy test was something that was not developed, was not discovered by modern day medicine until 1926. And the method of determining the sex of this child was something that was not developed until 1933. It took them until 1933 to confirm this barley wheat test that had been developed by the ancient Kemetians. So we see on many levels what people thought was a primitive science or a primitive culture is really much more sophisticated than we can ever give them credit for being. Antibiotics were discovered by the ancient Kemetians. And it was found that some of the antibiotics were derived from animal dung, from crocodile dung, even from the silt of the Nile. Now, it was interesting because certain physicians, when they saw some of the medical papyri which talked about using animal dung for the treatment of certain burns and wounds, thought that this was a sewage form of medicine. It was only until recently that they found that bacteria exists within animal dung that has healing properties. So once again, they're at a loss to begin to understand how and why it was these people developed this knowledge and this information. I also found out recently that the ancient Kemetians had discovered a plant. The root of this plant they could chew, and this would cause the increase in the production of melanocytes within their skin to protect them from more harmful rays of sunlight. And so this is a very important aspect of this ancient African culture and civilization. There's a papyrus called the Edwin Smith medical papyrus, which describes over 48 different types of injuries to the head, to the face, to the throat, and the spinal column, with specific symptoms and treatment. Now this is amazing for people that were backwards, people that were primitive, and had none of the advanced knowledge or sophistication that modern day scientists have. It's also been shown on several occasions where, upon examining some of the mummies, they found that the skulls of some of the mummies show evidence of cranial operations, show evidence where physicians went into the brain, performed surgery, and healing tissue began to form on the skull. They can see it. They don't know how they did it, but they know it was done. They don't know what forms of antiseptics they used, but they know that it was done. When we look at the story of Anthony and Cleopatra, we find that Cleopatra gave birth to a son by Julius Caesar, and the son was called Caesarean, and he was delivered through a process that we now call the cesarean section. Africans back at that point in time in history, about 30 BC, had knowledge that modern day scientists were not able to develop into until recently. So there's a wealth of knowledge and information, scientific knowledge and information, that people are just now beginning to really understand. What I want to do is to give you a series of definitions of some principles, some universal scientific laws, so that we can begin to get a better framework for the next part of this presentation. The word hierarchy relates to a simple or lower units combined to form complex units. And we can easily distinguish lower units from higher units. And when we deal with evolution, we can see this process in motion. We can see when looking at life on this planet, we see life has evolved from the so-called mineral kingdom to the plant kingdom to the animal kingdom to human beings. We see a hierarchy of various states of existence. This principle called rhythm is important because rhythm is a physical phenomenon which follows alternating cycles within a cyclical pattern itself, such as the cycle of inhaling and exhaling, the cycle of something being hot and cold, this physical manifestation of something going up and something else coming down, a cycle of the seasons, summer, fall, winter, spring, the cycle that goes on and on and on. Everything that is a part of our world exists because of certain cycles that take place. And there are oftentimes cycles that take place within other cycles. The word harmony is important because harmony goes on to describe something more than just a musical state of being. Harmony is a relationship, an inner relationship between forces. And what's been found is that there is a purely mathematical relationship between certain harmonic forces. The word netter, I talked about earlier, and netter represents the various principles or manifestations of the Creator expressed in varying degrees, representing principles or aspects of universal forces, i.e. Rays of light from the sun. And these rays of light from the sun have been symbolically referred to as angles. Rays come down in certain angles, and these angles have been referred to as angels, which are messages or aspects of the Creator. To evoke a specific netter or principle is to call into being one specific principle, one specific property alone. It's related to, but it's isolated from the other properties. So it's kind of like to evoke a netter or to bring forth a certain principle is kind of like having, to give you an analysis, it's kind of like having a telephone book. And in this telephone book you have 20 or 30 or 100 numbers, but you would use that telephone book to call up one specific number at a time. So the netters represent a variety of principles, concepts, and ideas, but to call on one particular netter is to evoke a particular principle, concept, or quality at one specific time. As people, as individuals, as persons, as human beings, we have this process, we have this ability to be able to call forth certain principles into manifestation. The whole idea, the whole concept of the hero, Joseph Campbell, in his book, The Power of Myths, has a chapter in which he talks about the importance of the hero, the prototype of the hero, and what mental frame of reference it sets for us. It establishes a certain role model, it establishes certain priorities for us. And he went on to cite that one of the problems with society today, one of the problems with youth today, is that they don't have certain heroes, they don't have certain role models that they can follow. So as an alternative to not having this process of learning or this process of evolving, they turn to other means of getting this knowledge and information or getting this inspiration. Games is one alternative to this rites of passage, or to this process of learning how to focus on or to bring into manifestation certain principles. The word hero is derived from the word heru or Horus, and it represents the ability to focus on a particular person or to focus on a particular quality or aspect, and to allow that quality or aspect to motivate you or to guide you or direct you or to influence you so that you can move to accomplish a specific task. So the importance of having heroes or knowing how to focus on specific aspects of life are necessary in order to be able to move from one dimension of life to the other. And this whole process kind of leads to another form that's entitled magic. Magic is important, and the understanding of what magic is significant because the contemporary interpretation of magic is something that deals with hocus pocus or nonsense, something that has no relevancy whatsoever. But magic is, in essence, the manipulation of harmonic forces which lie outside of sensory perception and are impossible to physically measure. So when we talk about forms of magic or forms of science that were expressed as magic, we're dealing primarily with people who had the ability to tap into other dimensions of thought, other dimensions of reality, other dimensions of consciousness, which could not be seen or touched or measured. And in dealing with traditional science, If you cannot see it, if you cannot touch it, if you cannot weigh it, if you cannot measure it, it doesn't exist. So what I'm saying essentially is that there's a whole realm, there's a whole dimension to reality that exists beyond this ability to see things, to touch things, to smell things, or to hear things. A magician then is a person, an individual who has developed the extrasensory perceivers to the point where they are able to possess the wisdom to know how to make the proper gesture at the proper place, at the proper time, in order to evoke a desired effect. It is a matter of knowing how to manipulate the elements through the word, or through certain movements, or through certain gestures, in order to bring things into manifestation. Now this whole process of another term for magician, another ancient term for magician, is necromancy. That is, someone who communicates with the dead. And this was a term that was given to the ancient Kemetians by the Greeks, because these ancient Africans had this power, had this ability to oftentimes communicate with the unseen, to communicate with the dead. The highest form of ancestral worship is to be able to communicate with the dead. By being able to communicate with the dead, then you are able to tap into certain levels of information, certain levels of consciousness. You're able to use that knowledge and information to dramatically influence your life. It allows you to do some phenomenal things. It's important too how the term black magic came about, and before it became something derogatory. Black magic simply expressed this process of dealing with things on a higher level that African people or black people were able to use. It's interesting too to see how this name has been applied to certain individuals. For example, Magic Johnson. It's obvious Magic is a brother, Magic is a black, so the reason why they call him Magic was because they symbolically talking about black magic. How this brother was able to do some supposedly impossible things or some phenomenal things as if they were magic. But essentially all he was doing was just tapping into a higher level of his consciousness. As Dr. King says, he was merely functioning on a human level, using all of the resources that he had available to him. When we look at ancient Kemet, one of the things that stands out most is the architecture. The temples, the pyramids, the other structures that have allowed us to begin to study this culture and civilization. And one of the recurring themes that you see over and over again is a theme that is associated with life, death, this cycle of life and death, which can be referred to as reincarnation, or the coming into flesh. If you look at much of the architecture in Kemet, particularly the Great Pyramid of Khufu, it embodies two very important principles, and that is that there were two roads, two paths to higher development. The pathways, or the room, or the passageways inside of the pyramid, the Great Pyramid, reflect two choices that we have as human beings. That is to choose the path of the way of Osiris, which is a matter of following and understanding the cyclical nature of things through successive reincarnations, or to choose the path of the way of Horus, which is the direct path to resurrection, knowledge and information achieved through a single lifetime. Now these were symbols of options or choices that were available to us based on how we understand, how we understood and implemented certain principles that were a part of our lives, that were there for us to understand. So if you were to study, for example, if you were to study the human soul, the concepts of the human soul, based on the historical information that has been provided, to me it would make more sense to study the records and the documents of people who have been delving in this field for over 7,000 years, as opposed to the people who have been dealing with it for the past 1,000 to 2,000 years. People who are novices at this. When you understand the differences between Budge's interpretation of the so-called Book of the Dead, and what these writings were in essence. The Book of the Dead, they call it the Book of the Dead because all of these writings were found in tombs of dead people, so obviously these must be writings or books of the dead, as opposed to understanding what they really were, where there were passages, information, passwords that the soul of this deceased person would be able to use in order to progress from one dimension of life to the next. It was, as the Commissioners called it, the book of the coming forth by day and night, the book of unfoldness, or the book of life, not the book of the dead. Totally different orientation to this process called life. The African tradition is rich in expressions of life that go beyond the physical life. They focus on a metaphysical form of existence. And when I speak of a metaphysical form of existence, I speak of it literally, in that the word metaphysics refers to something beyond the physical, something that exists beyond the physical. And when we study some of the symbolism of ancient Kemet, we see that this process is expressed in the symbolism, but we have to know how to interpret it. The caduceus, the symbol of medicine, the staff with the two serpents around it, is a symbol that was originally called the staff of Hermes, or the staff of Jehudi. That symbol represented the metaphysical anatomy of man. Now it's interesting how this symbol today represents the symbol of medicine. And you can talk to any doctor. If you talk to any doctor, you'll find that 9 out of 10 will be unable to tell you what that symbol means. It is a symbol of the medical profession, but few doctors know what it means. It is a metaphysical symbol that expresses, that represents the metaphysical anatomy that exists within man. That staff represents the spinal column. The two serpents represents the energy that flows into and out of the body. The masculine and feminine energy, or the electric and magnetic energy that flows around the spinal column. So that addresses, or that seems to suggest that there is another part of the human body, of the human mind, of the human spirit, that is not commonly talked about. Man is influenced by his environment. We can see just by studying some very basic data that more children, more babies are born during the time of the full moon. Man, woman is influenced by her environment. More elderly people suffer strokes and heart attacks during the time of the full moon. Most children, if you look at statistics of the birth of children, you'll find that more children are born during the early morning. You'll find that most heart attacks occur early in the day. Most fevers occur at night. Most people who suffer from asthma will have their asthma attacks. The greatest incidence of asthma attacks are in the morning. Certain mineral salts in the body are sensitive to planetary movements, and certain cell structures in the body are influenced by external cosmic forces. So in essence, one of the points that I'm trying to get across to you is that we are affected and influenced by forces outside of the planet Earth. And one of the most obvious influences is the moon, and the electromagnetic influence that the moon has on the planet Earth. That is the ability to affect the water of the Earth, to make the high and low tides. But at the same time, the moon exerts this electromagnetic gravitational force on the planet, pulling the water away from the surface, causing a high tide. It's also pulling the atmosphere away from the planet towards it. Because the atmosphere is something that you can't see, doesn't necessarily mean that this does not happen, or you cannot, that it's not taking place. To the same degree, the human body, like the planet Earth, is 3/4 water. So this same effect or this same relationship takes place within the human body. I want to share with you an interesting passage, quotation from the book Serpent in the Sky by John Anthony West, about the brain that represents a very important reality. The brain developed in order to receive and apprehend those aspects of universal consciousness necessary for man to perform his foreordained task. Just as the radio does not generate radio waves, but receives waves already there, the nature of consciousness determines the structure of the brain. The nature of sound determines the structure of the ear. The nature of light determines the structure of the eye. And the nature of the neters, or the forces of creation, determines the structure of man. Okay, we are a reflection of the universe. The word man literally means mind. If you go back and look at the ancient, the original definition of the word man, you will find that the word man means mind. The word woman means, in essence, the womb which produces the mind. One of the most important things about human beings is that they have one of the most highly evolved minds of any species on this planet. And one of the things that differentiates man from other animal life on this planet is the mind, is the ability to have free will. Animals are guided and directed by the neters, or the forces of creation. Animals have instinct, in which they are born with a genetic memory. That memory has encoded within the body or the mind of this animal all of the information that this animal needs to have in order to function at a certain level. I mean, nobody has written a manual for birds on how to build a nest, or how to fly south, or how to hunt. Animals are born with this information, and it is information that is passed on genetically through their genes. So to the same degree, there is knowledge and information that is inherent within human beings, but there is also a certain aspect, or a certain quality to the human mind, or to the senses, that we are able to tap into and utilize if we understand that these forces are there to be used. Man's senses are the creation of this world, and we have 5 basic senses that we all know of. These 5 basic senses are rooted to our 5 primary levels of awareness. If we increase our sensory perceivers, then we automatically increase our levels of awareness. The whole concept of ESP, extrasensory perception, deals with the principle, deals with the reality that we do have the ability to enhance our perception of reality beyond our 5 basic senses. And we do have the ability to do that. And once we do that, or to the degree that we are able to do that, is the degree that we will become aware, keenly aware of things that are going on around us. Now, the so-called mystics, or the so-called people who have developed ESP, are folk who can, according to the stories, read other people's minds. Thoughts are nothing but vibration, energy. They are able to pick up on those vibrations, on that energy, and to hear it and understand it. Certain other folk with ESP supposedly can see into the future. One of the African concepts of time deals with something that they call all time. All time exists in what they refer to as the eternal now. The past, present, and the future all exist right now. And the only thing that changes, the only thing that we are aware of, is our point in time right now. But other dimensions of time exist around us. It's simply a matter of developing the faculty, or the ability, to project yourself beyond this point in time and to see other dimensions, other aspects of time. Time is essentially a creation of man to help him keep track of where he was and where he's going. In this life, we are trained to resist our natural inclinations. We are trained to exist, to resist them. Okay? And training is different than education. Education deals with the idea that knowledge and information is already inside of you, and you live in an environment or function within an environment which allows you to bring out those things that are part of your existence. But when you are trained, you're oftentimes taught to do something that is contrary to your nature. You go to any circus and you see animals who have been trained. You know, elephants aren't trained to walk around on their two back feet, or tigers aren't born with a natural desire to want to jump through hoops or to allow a man to put his head in their mouth. But they can be trained to act contrary to their natural way of being. If you notice children too, before children are formally trained through this so-called miseducation process, they exhibit some natural habits or natural abilities that are important for human beings. For example, when you're feeding a child, if you ever notice you're feeding a child a sandwich, and that child will often open the sandwich, take the meat or the fish or whatever it is you have in the sandwich, and eat that separate from the bread. And you scold the child for messing up the sandwich. When if you deal with the whole science of eating, you get the most use out of your food when you don't combine your food. When you don't combine your starches with your protein. If you notice many children, particularly Yolanda, sometimes when she eats, you know, you'll put several vegetables on a plate, and if you notice the average person when they eat, they'll eat a fork full of this and a fork full of that and a fork full of that. But children oftentimes will just eat one thing at a time. They'll eat all their peas, and then they'll move to their carrots, and they'll eat all their carrots. That is the way you're supposed to eat. Because when you combine the foods, then you mix the signals to your stomach of what food is being sent down, so the wrong enzymes or digestive juices are secreted so that the food is not digested properly. So we already have a natural ability to know, but we are trained to resist those inherent qualities that we already have. We are miseducated. We are trained to believe in three very powerful myths. We are trained to believe, number one, that we live in a material world. Number two, that we use less than 10% of our brain. And three, that seeing is believing. These are three very powerful myths that really possess the lives of most people on this planet. To say that we live in a material world means that everything that exists in our world is the totality of reality. And it ignores a very important reality of life. And that is, before things come into manifestation in the physical world, they exist first in the metaphysical. And the physical expression is just the outgrowth of what has been developed first in the metaphysical realm of consciousness. Everything comes into being via this process. But if you are trained to focus just on the physical and not which brings the physical into manifestation, then you'll never be able to really understand what this whole process is all about. The idea that we use less than 10% of our brain is important, is profound. Because if you understand how everything that exists in the physical comes through our brain. Everything that we see, everything that is a part of our life was created by man. By man I mean the mind, the brain. And before it existed, or before it existed in the physical, before it was created or introduced or rediscovered by the mind, by man, it existed in another dimension. The brain or the mind is a faculty that has the ability to bring into it knowledge and information from another dimension. So if you understand what I'm saying, everything that is a part of our physical reality, of our physical world, everything that was created by man existed first in his mind. It came from this dimension called nothing, which is the source of everything. And if we use only 10% of our mind, that means we are not really functioning up to our true potential as human beings. And we are satisfied with that. The notion that seeing is believing is totally false. Seeing is believing means that you're going to base your ideas and your perceptions of reality only on what you can see. I think the slogan for Missouri, the state of Missouri is the show me state. And so show me, honey, you know, if I can't see it, I don't believe it. When in reality, it's exactly the opposite. This whole process of seeing is based on principles of properties of light. What we see is essentially the result of light bouncing off of an object, and those light waves bouncing off of that object into our eye. These light waves traveling along our optic nerve and creating, sending electrical impulses through our optic nerves into our brain, which recreates an image of what we see light bouncing off of. Okay? So that everything we see takes place through this process. And in dealing with this process, with the so-called visible light spectrum, the visible light spectrum represents less than 10% of all there is. So we are responding to less than 10%, and we think that this is all there is. Like, if you take this, see this, Charles, you see this? Mm-hmm. All right, I threw that to Charles and he caught it. What he was responding to was light bouncing off this object as it came closer and closer to him. And by his mind being able to convert those messages, those signals, to his muscles, it told his arms when to come up to grab it. He was responding to what he saw. Now, can he respond to things that he doesn't see? Yes. He is affected and he is influenced by things that are going on all around him that he can't see. We all are affected and influenced by things that are going on around us that we can't see. How many of us have ever done something and you stopped and asked yourself, why did I do that? You know, that was really stupid. You know, why did I do that? You know, what was it that made me do that? You know, there's some folk that just do things on a regular basis that they can't explain. You know, and it seems as though they may be possessed by something. You know, there's something that's just motivating them or directing them or guiding them to do something that they just can't seem to understand or take control of. What that deals with, on one hand, is the fact that there are forces which surround us, which affect and influence us on a regular basis. But if you think the only thing that can affect you and influence you are the things that you see, that means you're going to be wrong about 90% of the time. Okay? About 90% of the time. What I want to do is to show you a little demonstration that helps to get this idea across about light and how we respond to this whole light process, how it affects and influences our lives, what an impact it has on our life. And I want to use this light here. It's a high intensity light. And do a real simple experiment. I want to hold this one sheet of paper, this white sheet of paper, up to this light. And by holding this paper up to this light, nothing happens. See that? Nothing happens. But if I were to hold a black sheet of paper up to this very same light, hold it up to the light, and something starts to happen. Okay? The same light waves that hit this white paper did nothing. But to this black paper, they will cause it to set on fire and to burn if I leave it there long enough. What does that mean? What does that represent? Basically, it represents certain properties of light. Okay, light is all colors. White light is all colors together. Blackness, when we're talking about light, represents the absence of color. When we're dealing with colors as opposed to light, it's just the opposite. White is the absence of color, and black is all colors. Okay? Black is all colors. So then, when we deal with colors and when we deal with light, we find that white light is all colors of the light spectrum together. Black, the color black, is the combination of all colors together. Now, opposites attract. All of the colors in the light spectrum are attracted to all of the colors here. And black has a tendency to absorb light. And this absorption of these rays of light will cause a reaction in this paper that won't take place in this paper. So-called invisible rays of light have an effect on people who have color in them, an effect that it doesn't have on people who don't have color. A good example of that can be found in the whole controversy that's brewing now about the deterioration of the ozone. With the deterioration of the ozone, harmful UVB rays of light are now coming into the atmosphere. These are things that we can't see now. A certain spectrum of sunlight is now coming into the Earth's environment in greater numbers. And these invisible rays of light are now being absorbed into our bodies to a greater degree. People with dark skin are able to absorb these invisible rays of light and to convert them into, to take these free radicals and to convert them into useful purposes within the body. People that don't have this dark protective covering, people who have lighter skin, who don't have high concentrations of melanin, their skin will burn from the rays of light from the sun, just like this paper burn. Okay? Once again, we're showing you on one hand the reaction of physical things to things that are invisible. Rays of light, or the varying degrees of radiation that come from the sun, are so powerful that they're able to penetrate literally miles beneath the interior of the earth. These cosmic rays travel through our bodies. And our bodies, like this dark sheet of paper here, are absorbing these rays. These rays have the ability of causing some very interesting things to take place within our body. Now, if we understand how we are affected and influenced by color, then we can begin to understand something about this other dimension of reality that exists. You know, and a good example of that can be seen in fall. Every year in fall, the leaves change color. The changing of the color of the leaves is a really simple phenomenon that occurs primarily because of the fact that the days get shorter, the days are cooler, and as a result of the cooling of the atmosphere, then the chloroform no longer flows through the leaves of the plant. And since it doesn't flow as much, then colors that are already present in the leaf become visible to the eye. The red, the yellow, the other colors, the golden colors, that are always there, only become visible to the eye when the forces of light, the sun, change. And we can see what is always there. So we are only reacting to another system, or to another process. The light that leaves the sun, falls on planet Earth, takes 8 minutes, almost 9 minutes to get here. And that light affects and influences everything on this planet. And to begin to understand how significant that is and how we respond to this, if you watch the sunset, you watch the sunset and the sun sets behind the mountain and the sun sets underneath the earth, and it's gone. But in reality, the sun actually set 8 minutes prior to your seeing it. You are responding to something that already happened. So to that degree, we have to ask ourselves, how else are we responding to things that have already happened? Which means that we are out of sync with time. And time is the most important thing in the universe. Sunrises, sunsets are important. The equinoxes and the solstices are important because they have a way of connecting us back to these sources of creation, connecting us back with life, with the universe, so to speak. The effects of sun on plant life, sunlight on the plants causes this process of photosynthesis, which causes the production of foodstuff within the plants, causes the plants to grow. There's also a corresponding relationship between sunlight and the human body. And melanin, the secretion of chemicals and hormones within the human body. There is a disorder, seasonal, what is it called? Seasonal disorder. It is a seasonal disorder that takes place around this time of year when people become mentally and sometimes emotionally depressed. And they become depressed because of a lack of sunlight. Scientists have developed the means of creating artificial sunlight or exposing these people to artificial sunlight in order to change their mental attitude. Something as simple as light has a phenomenal effect on our thinking, and it also has a phenomenal effect on the secretion of hormones within our body, which regulate all of the activities that take place within the human body. Short example, good example of this can be found in the pineal gland, and the secretion of hormones from the pineal gland, melatonin and serotonin. The production of these hormones is created by sunlight, and the relationship, or the significance of the relationship between the amount of sun and our level of spiritual receptivity or spiritual consciousness is very important, in that it is the exposure of sun to our body, and the skin is the largest organ of the body. Okay, the skin is loaded with these melanocytes, which are able to convert this sunlight, this cosmic energy from the sun, into chemical substances which flow through our body and affect and influence us mentally and spiritually. So that the more sunlight we are exposed to during the summer months, the more of this spiritually inducing hormone, melatonin, is manufactured. When the days begin to shorten after the fall equinox, then one of the things that happens is, as a result of us experiencing longer nights, while on the one hand, those people that are not able to make this adjustment to the changing in the season may experience seasonal disorder, may experience depression because of the secretion of this hormone. On the other hand, our ancestors knew that it was during this time of year that we were more susceptible to spiritual influence. This is the time of highest spiritual receptivity. It's a time when if we deal with and understand the whole essence of ancestral worship, we understand the significance of our being able to project our consciousness outside of our body when we sleep, when this hormone called melatonin is secreted, we're able to experience higher levels of spiritual consciousness, then that allows us the ability to tap into other dimensions of thought. It allows us the ability to be able, if we are aware, if we have been educated as opposed to trained, if it allows us the ability to be able to begin to plan and formulate things to come into existence for us by being able to focus on specific objectives and to be able to bring them through into manifestation by being able to control our thoughts and make these things become a reality. This is something that we all have the potential to do. This is one of the reasons why in almost all religious traditions, December 25th was regarded as the birth of spiritual creators. December 25th was referred to as the birth of the Christ. The Christ is a title which means the anointed one. It is a symbol that is associated with spiritual enhancement. December 25th is important because as we deal with this cycle of the importance of sunlight, the effect and influence that sunlight has on the planet, it is after December 25th that the days begin to lengthen and this life cycle begins all over again. So to understand that reality and to be able to attune yourself to that reality allows you to exercise more control over yourself. But you interfere with this natural process. We have been trained to throw off or to inhibit this natural process by eating excessively during this time of year, by drinking, or by partying. The time of the greatest level of spiritual receptivity, we have been trained to do those things contrary to bringing out the best in us. That's important. And the important thing is to understand why this is. It is primarily because of the fact that information is power, and we are not in control of the information. Those people that have controlled the information for the past 2,000 years, those people who have been able to study the knowledge and information and sciences that have been developed and accumulated by the ancient Kemetians, have been able to see and understand the correlation between following certain realities and being able to practice them, put them into practice, and to be able to benefit from it. If everybody was able to practice and to understand these things, then the quality of life for African Americans would be dramatically different. Instead of finding ourselves on the bottom, we would probably find ourselves on the top. But since we are not in control of the information process, then this knowledge and information is kept away from us, and we aren't able to use that knowledge and information that would allow us to truly become the people that we have the capacity to be. And essentially, I've said it on numerous occasions, and I have to say it again, and that is that we are the best kept secret on the planet. We don't know who we are. And part of us being the best kept secret on the planet is to deal with this whole issue, is to continue to debate whether or not we're black, Negro, colored, Africans, or African Americans. As long as we continue to debate these issues, then we will never begin to plug into the knowledge and information that have been developed and is waiting there for us to use. I was reading an article that came out of Esquire magazine called The Unholy Wars, an article between the conflict between Jews and blacks in Chicago. And there was one interesting statement in this article. Now, the article is now the subject of a letter writing campaign to Esquire magazine and the advertisers of Esquire magazine. It's the subject of a boycott that's being initiated by an organization in California because of the negative perceptions of African Americans that is presented in this article. But one particular paragraph in this article said an awful lot. It was talking about the Six-Day War that Israel fought against Egypt in 1967. And it said that that Six-Day War served as a catalyst for the Jewish community, particularly in the United States, coming together. The author of this article was paralleling the movements or the activities of the Jews in Israel and the Jews in the United States and black folks in the United States. He was saying around 1967, black folks were beginning to exercise so-called black power. Black radicals were boldly walking down the street with their guns, with their weapons, at a time when Israel had enough military force to win this Six-Day War in opposition to all the other European powers who were against them. They had the military might to win this war. Black folk were walking up and down the street with their few rifles and guns. They were later suppressed by the police, who grew weary of their antics, particularly the Black Panther Party. And when the so-called black militants were repressed, they didn't have a system of beliefs that the Jews had to fall back on. They didn't have a 4,000-year history as the Jews did. The Jews had the Torah, and the blacks were waiting for Alex Haley to tell them of their roots. I understand the significance of this. I understand the significance of us not knowing who we are, not being in control of the knowledge and information that can free us, but also being aware of the fact that just because of the fact that we don't control the knowledge and information doesn't mean that we can't gain access to it. The knowledge and information is here. In essence, we have the ability to draw to us those things that we focus our mind on, those things that we focus our attention on. You ever had the occasion where you thought about somebody and a few minutes later they called you, or you bumped into them on the street and you just write it off to a coincidence, but never really stopped to understand, well, how is it I was able to think about that person just before I met them? Did I know that I was going to meet that person? Did my mind expand to a certain level where I was able to see that I was going to meet that person? Rather than explore these aspects, we just write it off to some strange happening, primarily because of the fact we have been trained to believe that those aspects that deal with the development of our higher level of consciousness are black magic, voodoo, deal with devil worship, things that will get us in more trouble than they will cause us to benefit from. So once again, we have to begin to look at how do we get into this framework of thinking. Were we responsible for creating these concepts and ideas that keep us away from ourselves? No. We are reacting to thoughts and ideas that have been created by other people. So we begin to see that our only recourse is to know ourselves. Our only recourse is to begin to be willing to explore other dimensions of thought, other dimensions of reality, and to begin to look beyond standards that other people have determined for us. To be unafraid, to experiment, and to try new things. I want to do another demonstration that I think expresses this idea, this concept very well. And in order to do this, I'd like to have a couple of volunteers. I need 4. 1, 2, 3, 1 more. 4. Okay, could the 4 come up, please? Lift her up out of the chair by using just 2 fingers each. Okay? So if I can have you over here, if you can stand over here, please. And you stand right here. Charles, why don't you two switch? Switch up. Yeah. Just get the energies balanced right. And what I want you all to do is to put your hands together just like this, 2 fingers together, just like this. And the 2 of you are going to get right underneath her knee, and you and I are going to get right underneath her arm and lift her up. Okay, so let's just wait until let's wait and try. All right, now basically what's going to happen is first time we try to do it, we're going to have a little difficulty. I have a little conference with them, and then the second time we'll be able to do it with no problem whatsoever, and then I'll explain to you what this whole process is. So, and I don't want you all to strain. Just be very, just be very natural with this. Don't have to exert any effort and any extra energy at all. Okay? On the count of 3, just lift. 1, 2, 3. Okay. Okay. You just relax. Just be calm. Nothing's gonna happen to you. Let's try it one more time. Let's try it one more time. Just be still. You don't have to lift your arms up now. Just be still. Okay. Okay. All right. 1, 2, 3. Just give us some dead weight. Okay. All right. Now that was so-so. All right. Let's do this. Let's have a seat. We're not finished yet. Put your hand right above mine. Let it go first. Put your hand right above hers. Your hand right above her. Your other hand on top of mine. Okay. I want you to focus. Let's lift that up and create an image of your mind. Just too good. And you're really good at all. Okay, let's be able to lift this and lift your crisis out of the way. At all. Everybody see that? One more time. On the count of 3. 1, 2, 3. Okay. All right, thank you. Now, what all of that did to illustrate was that there are things that we can do that might appear to be magic, might appear to be extremely phenomenal, but are very simple. Very, very simple. The whole idea of the 4 of us coming together to lift this sister up out of the chair basically dealt with the fact that we were able to focus our energies on a particular objective. Understanding basic functions of the body, and that is the body is an instrument through which energy flows into and out of. The left side of your body has traditionally been viewed as the feminine side of your body through which energy comes into. The right side of your body has been viewed as the masculine side of your body through which energy flows out of. So by us, and then energy centers are located at various sites along your spinal cord and come into and out of your body primarily through your head or the crown chakra. In symbolism, in religious symbolism, we see this expressed as the halo above the head of Christ, or the halo around the angels. We see it expressed as the 1,000-petaled lotus on the head of Buddha. This is symbolic of the energy that flows through the body. This is one of the primary reasons why the symbol for medicine is the same as the symbol for the metaphysical anatomy of man, that is the caduceus. That is the symbol with the staff and the 2 serpents intertwined around the staff. Those 2 serpents represent the feminine and the masculine side of the body, which wrap around your spinal column. The energy flows through your body. So what we did essentially was to utilize this energy in our body and direct our minds on a specific objective. And by issuing that command to our mind, we were able to do something that supposedly defies gravity. But what it does is to illustrate the capacity that exists within the mind. Okay? The body is a servant of the mind. Your body can be trained and conditioned to do almost anything that your mind can focus it on doing. There was an experiment where they took some people and had them shoot a basketball through a hoop. And then they took one segment of the people and told them, we want you to practice every day shooting a basketball through a hoop. They took another segment of these people and said, we don't want you to do anything. We want you to just go about your regular business. And then they took another segment and said, we want you to mentally think about shooting that basketball through the hoop. We don't want you to go out on the basketball court and practice. Just mentally think about doing it. And so when they brought all three groups back together again to see what percentage had improved in shooting the basketball through the hoop, they found that the people who had practiced on a regular basis shooting the basketball through the hoop had improved to the same degree as those people who had mentally done the same thing. Those who didn't do anything didn't show any improvement whatsoever. So the essence behind this experiment that they performed was to show that by mentally putting your thoughts into action, you can achieve the same results as you can physically, and sometimes you can exceed that, your physical efforts. So it just goes to show the untapped ability that exists within the human mind. The mind's ability to tap into this metaphysical realm of consciousness and bring in through it anything. Anything. I mean, an excellent example, it's twofold, and I'll close on this so we can take some questions. Twofold example. If African people had the ability to develop their minds to the point where they are able to create some of the most remarkable architectural structures that have ever existed on this planet, they were able to create temples that have withstood the test of time, earthquakes, still standing. They have been able to develop high levels of science and technology that have not been duplicated today. And that says that there's something that is inherent within the African people to do these things. But if these folk can be conditioned or brainwashed into believing that they are not these African people, that they are someone else, are people who have no heritage, who have no culture, who have made no contributions whatsoever, then it means that they will never begin to even think that they have the capacity to do anything great. And then if in addition to that, drugs and other habits are introduced to keep them further off course, then it means that they will never to even begin to think about what they could possibly think about doing. So the point is that our ability to know who we are, our ability to free our minds, lies solely within us. It means that we have to begin to use all of those things that we have at our disposal, all of the knowledge and information that we have at our disposal, to learn who we are. Not accept someone else's definition of who you are, but to dig, to become interested in doing the research, historical research, and then to begin to apply that knowledge and information in your life. Anything that was done in the past means that you have the capacity to do it right now, and your children will have the capacity to do it in the future. If you destroy that connection with the past, then it means you've also wiped out any sort of capacity for the future. And if you look at most black folk, we exist, the majority of us exist in a state of right now. The only thing we think about is right now. We cannot think beyond tomorrow. And as long as we are locked into a mode of instant gratification and are not willing to take the time to read, take the time to develop our minds, take the time to plant a seed, a foundation for us to be able to benefit from later on, that we will never be able to reap our true potential, which also means, on the other hand, that those people that have this knowledge and information will be able to take advantage of us. And in the midst of this manifestation, this reality, we see that a handful of black folk have made it. And those who have made it in areas primarily that involve creative thinking. The comedians, the athletes, the movie stars are those people who tap into their creative mind, the right hemisphere, or the intuitive aspect of the brain. So they're able to do or to bring into manifestation that part of their consciousness that has been locked away from them. Shows you the potential that exists within us. And it's also very important because time is of the essence, particularly in light of the fact that more and more information is starting to come out now about our history. More of our people are beginning to make those historical connections, those mental connections. We're beginning to wake up and make some profound changes in our life. So how is the other population responding to this? If you would notice, look what's happening in Poland. Look what's happening in Germany. It's no accident, it's no coincidence that many of the major summits that take place with the Western powers, I mean the major summits, take place around the winter solstice, around December, close to Christmas. It's no accident. One of the things that we have to become aware of is the fact that in 1992, the European population is preparing for the sesquicentennial celebration. It is Columbus's 500-year celebration of the discovery of America. Major celebration is being planned. And also they're planning for the development of a unified monetary system. So there's going to be some phenomenal changes made in the world. Now, we don't necessarily have to be aware of or a part of those changes in order to be able to survive or to benefit from those changes, because there are some other forces that we can tap into, that we can utilize, if we are aware of the fact that we have that capacity. So what I wanted to do is just give you some food for thought, to make you stop and think, to make you begin to use the time that we have here to consider developing ourselves and reaching our full potential, and particularly the next few weeks. The next few weeks are critical if we are to begin to plant those seeds that will allow you to benefit in the 1990s, if you are to begin to develop the pattern that is going to be able to liberate you for the 21st century. So once again, the power lies not within the enemy, but within yourself. And it begins by you believing that the power is within you and allowing it to come forward. And when you do, when you issue the command, when you begin to set things in motion, you will find that doors will open and your life will change dramatically. So I'll close at this point in time, and I'll take any questions that you might have. No questions?
As I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I take a look at my life and realize there's nothing left. Cause I've been blasting and laughing so long that even my mama thinks that my mind is gone. But I ain't never crossed a man that didn't deserve it. Me be treated like a punk, you know that's unheard of. You better watch how you're talking and where you're walking, or you and your homies might be lying to chalk. I really hate the trip, but I gotta low. As they croak, I see myself in the pistol smoke. Fool, I'm the kind of G the little homies wanna be like, on my knees in the night, saying prayers in the street life.